They say the prairie wind carries secrets, and sometimes it blows them right into your path. On a scorching summer day, by a remote lake near Dodge City, Kansas, an innocent bride found herself moments away from a grim fate pushed under cold water by cruel hands, her future doomed to slip away like ripples on the surface. But fate had other plans. When a wealthy ranch owner, Colton Granger, appeared out of nowhere astride a proud stallion, his heart pounded with righteous fury. Little did he know that in saving this stranger, he would claim not just her life, but also her heart. Before the sun dipped behind those endless plains, Harriet Mackenzie stared at the horizon, her cheeks stung by the harsh Kansas wind. The wagon train had rattled along the Santa Fe Trail for weeks, carrying families dreaming of a better life in the West. Harriet's father, George. Mackenzie had insisted they leave St. Louis behind. The frontier called to him, promising open skies and opportunity. Harriet's fiancé, a choice made more by obligation than romance, was Jeremy Carter, a man her father admired for his stubborn ambition. Harriet, however, felt only the heaviness of dread whenever he was near. In late June, the wagon train veered off the main trail to find fresh water near a secluded lake. Tall cottonwood trees whispered overhead, and a bright sun shimmered across the rippling surface. Harriet thought the peaceful scenery could ease her mind, yet beneath the quiet exterior, something dark brewed. Jeremy had grown increasingly controlling, demanding Harriet's obedience. He was no longer the polite suitor who had first asked for her hand at a church social back in Missouri. Out here, away from civilization, Harriet saw a cruelty in him she couldn't ignore. They camped near the water's edge, and Harriet found herself restless that evening, her thoughts swirling like dust devils. She wandered off to collect her own peace beneath the cottonwoods. The muffled voices of Jeremy and his family drifted across the camp, a tense discussion that left Harriet uneasy. She'd caught their hard stares at her all day. Jeremy wanted to speed up their wedding. Harriet wanted more time. Night fell, and Harriet felt an invisible rope tighten around her life. The settlers planned a ceremony the very next day, right by the lakeshore. Harriet had no say in the matter. When she tried to tell her father she wasn't ready, George Mackenzie insisted that Jeremy was a good man who could provide for her. In her father's eyes, Harriet's duty was to obey, heart-pounding. Harriet realized she was utterly alone. Just before dawn, Harriet made her decision she would run. She stuffed some clothes into a small satchel and crept past the sleeping forms near the wagons. But the Carter family was vigilant. Jeremy, ever suspicious, had taken to sleeping lightly. The scrape of Harriet's boots against the dry earth alerted him. He sprang from his bedroll, and with a silent signal, he roused two of his burly cousins. Harriet was seized before she could reach her mare. A cold gust of wind blew across the plains as she struggled in their grip, dread clawing at her throat. Jeremy's gaze hardened. "You think you can just run off?" he hissed. "You made a promise. We're getting married. Harriet, whether you want to or not." Too terrified to speak, Harriet felt her heart pound like thunder. She imagined the safety of the old life in St. Louis. That world felt 1,000,000 miles away. In the darkest hour before dawn, Harriet had no way of knowing that a wealthy rancher named Colton Granger was already saddling his horse a few miles away, about to ride straight into her life and change it forever. Colton Granger awoke that same dawn, well before the sunrise. On his sprawling ranch west of Dodge City, the roosters had not yet crowed, but Colton rarely needed them to greet the day. He was a man driven by both duty and an unspoken restlessness that had followed him since boyhood. Some said he was the wealthiest rancher in Ford County, an ambitious cattleman with a keen business sense and an open heart. Others whispered that his father's gambling debts had forced Colton to grow up too fast, forging his determined spirit. The ranch was called High Plains Haven, a swath of land Colton had painstakingly expanded. He owned over 1,000 head of cattle each, branded with a horseshoe and star, the Granger family emblem. His crew of ranch hands respected him, not just because of his deep pockets, but because he never asked another man to do work he wouldn't do himself. The days were long, filled with the scent of fresh hay, the lowing of cattle and the shine of well-worn saddles. For Colton, that was the good life. But on this particular morning, a thorn of unease pricked his thoughts. He had promised to check on a water source along one of his outer properties, a patch of land near an old lake that used to belong to a defunct homesteader. Recent droughts made every water source precious, and rumors circulated that wagon trains passing through might be depleting the supply. He saddled up his favorite horse, a silver-gray stallion named Marshall, named in homage to the famed lawmen of Dodge City, like Wyatt Earp. He carried a Winchester rifle slung across his back, a necessary tool in these parts, where stray coyotes or desperate men might lurk. Riding across the open prairie at first light gave Colton a sense of renewed purpose. Dawn's pale light stretched across the rolling grasslands, illuminating clumps of sagebrush. The wind whispered of possibility. He had no inkling of the danger that awaited him at the lake, nor how drastically his life was about to change. Half an hour into his ride, he spotted faint smoke rising from somewhere near the lake's south side campfires, likely from a traveling group of settlers. Colton found himself wondering if they had enough supplies to make it further west, or if they'd deplete his land's water without a second thought. He would approach them civilly, maybe offer a few pointers or direct them to better stopping points. But he knew from experience that not all travelers took kindly to unsolicited advice, especially from a well-off rancher they assumed had never struggled. As the sun inched higher, Colton urged Marshall into a canter. He paused on a small bluff overlooking the lake. Down below he caught sight of a rickety campsite, several wagons arranged in a rough circle, a smouldering fire, and a handful of men standing knee-deep in the water. Something was off. Even from this distance, he could tell a commotion was underway. A strange tension hung in the air. Colton pressed his lips together and guided Marshall down the incline. He approached cautiously, eyes sharp. Then he heard it, a scream that rattled across the surface of the still water. An agonized, desperate cry. A woman's cry. With a jolt of adrenaline, he spurred Marshall into a gallop, heading for the source of that terrified wail, unaware that every galloping stride was carrying him closer to a fate he never could have imagined. The sun peered over the horizon, splashing gold across the lake, turning the water into molten reflections. Harriet found herself dragged to the shallows, her hands bound behind her with a coarse rope. Jeremy's cousins Bill and Carl Carter wore grim expressions. They muttered under their breath, each uncertain how far Jeremy planned to take this. Yet their loyalty to the family, to the notion that Harriet belonged to Jeremy, overrode their pity. Jeremy's eyes glowed with a feverish determination. "You tried to run, Harriet," he snapped. "That's not what a faithful bride does." Her eyes pleaded. She was no longer just frightened. She was angry, outraged that these men believed they held the power to decide her fate. "I never wanted this wedding," Harriet managed, voice trembling. "You know that. Let me go." "Let me," Jeremy slapped her, the force sending her sprawling into the muddy water. Shock and pain burst through her. "You'll do as I say," he snarled. "You belong to me now." A Mackenzie promised a Carter. That means something out here, from the shore. Harriet's father stood pale and uncertain. George Mackenzie looked as though every fibre of his being warred between paternal concern and the fear of losing Jeremy's favour. A quiet voice in his mind whispered that Harriet was safer as Jeremy's wife than left to fend for herself on the merciless frontier. He convinced himself that Jeremy's outburst was an overreaction, not a sign of deeper violence. Torn between his own cowardice and paternal guilt, George mumbled half-hearted protests, but the Carters were already beyond reason. Jeremy clutched Harriet's hair, forcing her head under the shallow water. Icy panic seized her lungs. She kicked and thrashed her heart, hammering a deafening beat. The edges of her vision blurred, her chest burned. Would they truly kill her? When Jeremy finally pulled her up, Harriet gasped for air water, streaming from her face. Rage burned in Jeremy's eyes. "You'll obey," he spat, "or you'll spend more time underwater than you'd like." In that moment, just as Harriet's captors pushed her back into the water, Colton Granger stormed onto the scene. Marshall's hooves pounding against the rocky shore. Colton's gaze locked on the unfolding horror. He saw a woman half-submerged, being held down by force. Without hesitation, he leapt off his horse. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. One hand hovered near his hip, where a Colt revolver gleamed. What in the devil's name is going on? Jeremy and his cousins froze. The morning light revealed a scowling stranger, tall in the saddle eyes, sharp as a hawk's. The air crackled with tension. Bill Carter let go of Harriet's shoulders, spooked by the intruder's commanding presence. Jeremy, however, kept his grip tight on Harriet. "This is none of your concern," Jeremy barked, even as Harriet coughed and gasped for breath. "We're dealing with a family matter." Colton's expression hardened every fibre of his being, ready to draw if necessary. "You're trying to drown her," he said, voice taut with controlled fury. "I don't take kindly to such cruelty, family matter or not." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Jeremy glared. Harriet's father looked away in shame, and Harriet, waterlogged and trembling, stared at this bold stranger with a glimmer of desperate hope. Then the hush shattered with a single moment of decision, one that would change every life here. Harriet's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she felt the muddy water recede from her shoulders. Her senses reeled the morning sun, suddenly too bright. She met eyes with the stranger, Colton Granger, who stood tall and resolute, his hand hovering near the revolver at his waist. In that second, hope flared within her. Maybe this man was her chance to escape a cruel future. Jeremy bristled, his temper flaring like a prairie fire. He noticed the rifle slung across Colton's back and the revolver within easy reach. Jeremy's own sidearm was on his belt, but still holstered. Bill and Carl Carter exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to pushing around people they believed beneath them, Harriet included, but this stranger radiated an authority they weren't prepared to challenge. Even so, their loyalty to Jeremy was unwavering. "This is my fiancée." Jeremy spat. "She's run off once already. We're teaching her some respect." Colton's jaw tightened. "Respect looks more like you're teaching her how to drown." He took a step forward. Harriet, still bound, remained kneeling in the shallows, struggling to breathe. Her father hovered uncertainly on the shore, wringing his hands. The Carters formed a half-circle around Harriet, as though guarding her from rescue. Tension crackled in the air like static before a lightning strike. Out here, where the law existed more in the barrels of guns than in any courthouse, it wasn't unusual for a dispute to end in bloodshed. Colton knew this. He also knew he wouldn't leave without Harriet. He squared his shoulders, gaze shifting between Jeremy and the other men. "Untie her." Colton demanded, voice low. "Now." Jeremy laughed, a dry, menacing sound. "You really want to die over a woman you don't know? We can settle this right here." He placed a hand on his revolver. Harriet felt her stomach twist in dread, but Colton didn't waver. "I'd think twice," Colton said, and the warning in his voice was ice cold. "I'm not alone. My ranch hands are on the bluff." It was a bluff in itself. No one else was there. But Jeremy didn't know that. "One whistle from me, and you'll be outnumbered and outgunned." For a tense moment, Bill and Carl shifted anxiously. They scanned the high ground, searching for signs of backup. Jeremy's brow furrowed, doubt creeping in. Harriet could barely keep herself from sobbing, but she forced her breath to steady, to remain strong. Suddenly, Jeremy snapped, "Fine." He loosened his grip on Harriet's arm, but made no move to untie her. "But this is between me and her. Who are you to interfere?" Colton took another step forward. He could feel the cold metal of his revolver pressing against his side, the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. A man who won't stand by while innocent people are abused. "Untie her," he repeated, "and let me take her from here. This is over." The Carters hesitated, unsure of their next move. Harriet's father, George, finally stepped forward, his face pale. "Jeremy, please, let's end this. We can sort out the wedding later. Harriet's had enough." He tried to sound authoritative, but it came out shaky. In the back of his mind, Jeremy felt cornered, furious at losing control. His chest heaved. Then, with jerky movements, he motioned for Bill and Carl to release Harriet. Her bounds remained, but they let go of her shoulders, stepping back an inch. Harriet half collapsed, gulping for air. Water dripped from her hair, and her dress clung to her slight frame, streaked with mud. Colton quickly moved to Harriet's side and helped her to her feet, ignoring the menacing stares around him. "Easy now," he murmured. Harriet stared into his eyes, a mix of gratitude and lingering terror. The warmth of his strong grip reminded her she was still alive. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a shaking breath of relief. "That's far enough," Jeremy barked, his hand tightening around his holster. "She's coming back to our camp after this. We'll handle it in our own way." Colton's lips formed a grim line. "She's not your property," he said, guiding Harriet behind him. "If she wants to come with me, she will." A hush fell. Harriet leaned on Colton for support, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a tremor of hope. The next moments would be critical, deciding whether blood would stain these waters, or if Harriet would finally gain her freedom. Harriet's heart pounded as she stood behind Colton, whose tall frame felt like an unassailable fortress. The morning sun climbed higher, bathing the lakeshore in harsh light that seemed to spotlight every tense face. Jeremy's glare flickered between Harriet and Colton, furious at losing control of the situation. Jeremy barked, "You don't know this man. You think he's going to take care of you. You're a fool." His voice wavered with desperation. If Harriet left with this stranger, Jeremy's power, his entire sense of ownership over her would collapse. Colton untied Harriet's wrists, wincing at the angry welts left by the rope. She swallowed hard, but relief flooded her veins. No longer bound, she felt a rush of liberation that almost took her breath away. She locked eyes with Jeremy. "I'd rather gamble on a stranger's kindness," she said through chattering teeth, "than spend one more hour under your brutality." George Mackenzie, Harriet's father, stood dumbfounded. Part of him wanted to intervene. This was his daughter, after all. Yet fear and pride kept him rooted. He shot Harriet a mournful look, as though silently begging her forgiveness for allowing things to go this far. The Carters tensed, ready to pounce if Jeremy gave the word. But Jeremy hesitated, sensing that to draw on this stranger, who seemed so confident, might be a fatal mistake. "You don't know who you're messing with," Jeremy hissed at Colton. "We have friends on this trail, and I promise you we'll come for her." Colton's steady gaze never wavered. He quietly positioned himself, anticipating any sudden move from the Carters. "You and your friends can try," he said, voice firm. "Just remember the Granger Ranch is well guarded, and the law in Dodge City doesn't look kindly on men who assault women." Somewhere in the back of Jeremy's mind, the name Granger clicked. The story of a wealthy rancher near Dodge City rang a bell, someone with influence. Attacking such a man might invite a storm of trouble, not just from lawmen, but from every hired gun Colton could muster. Weighing his options, Jeremy finally spat in the dirt. He jerked his head at Bill and Carl, who then eased away. Harriet, still trembling, took a step closer to Colton's horse. She hardly believed she was truly free to leave. Part of her expected Jeremy to spring forward at the last second. But as the seconds passed, and no one moved, a tidal wave of relief washed over her. Colton helped her onto Marshall's broad back, then swung himself up behind her. Harriet clutched the saddle horn, adrenaline still making her limbs shaky. "Let's go," Colton said, turning Marshall away from the Carter clan. A rush of wind and hooves carried them to safer ground. Harriet's last glimpse of Jeremy was of him standing in the shallows, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. As they cantered up the bluff, Harriet closed her eyes against the bright sky. She felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears of gratitude, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense that for the first time her life was about to truly begin. Colton's arm was firm around her waist, steadying her. Every beat of Marshall's hooves pulled Harriet further from a forced marriage and closer to an uncertain yet promising future. When they finally slowed at the crest of a rolling hillside, Harriet drew in a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to face Colton. The words felt woefully insufficient for the magnitude of what he'd done. Colton simply nodded, his expression softening. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle. The morning sun caught the trace of concern in his eyes, mixed with something else. Perhaps admiration. Harriet felt her heart flutter. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry," he added. "Then you can decide what you want to do next." For Harriet, there was no going back. Her old life, her old obligations had been severed on that lakeshore. Whether it was fate or sheer luck that brought Colton Granger to her rescue, she couldn't help but sense a profound shift in destiny. Her journey was just beginning. Colton guided Marshall across the plains at a steady pace, taking a route he knew well. Harriet, still trembling, leaned into him for balance. Each breath of open air tasted like freedom. The further they rode from the lake, the more her panic ebbed, replaced by a cautious optimism she'd never felt before. An hour passed before they reached the outskirts of High Plains, Haven Colton's expansive ranch. Harriet's eyes widened at the sight, an endless sea of golden grass dotted with grazing cattle and sturdy ranch buildings. Several ranch hands paused in their chores to stare curiously. Some had heard rumors about their boss's sense of justice, but to see him arrive with a waterlogged stranger was another matter altogether. Colton dismounted smoothly, then offered a hand to help Harriet down. She nearly collapsed when her boots touched the ground, her legs weak from the morning's ordeal. At once, two ranch hands, an older man named Hank and a younger cowhand called Levi, hurried over to see if they could assist. Colton lifted a hand to keep them from crowding her too much. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm. "Miss Mackenzie here needs a warm place to rest and some dry clothes. Levi fetched some blankets from the bunkhouse. Hank heat water for tea. Harriet blinked at the mention of tea. Such a small gesture. And yet the thoughtfulness brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, looking from one face to another. The ranch hands nodded kindly, sensing her fragility. Together they guided her into the main ranch house, a large two-story structure built of sturdy timber. Inside, Harriet found a surprisingly welcoming interior. A broad stone fireplace occupied one wall, and rugs made from buffalo hide covered the wooden floors. Though it was a rancher's home, it had cozy touches, evidence of a man who valued comfort amidst his labor. Colton led her to a chair near the hearth, while Hank brought a kettle to boil on the small cook stove. Harriet cradled her arms, still chilled to the bone, despite the warming fire. Colton knelt beside her, concern etched on his face. "Here," he said, draping a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. "I'll find you some dry clothes shortly." She nodded her lips, quivering with an odd mix of relief and lingering fear. "Everything was happening so quickly, I don't want to impose," Harriet said, her voice barely a whisper. "You've done so much already. If you let me rest a moment, I can be on my way." Colton shook his head. "You're no imposition. Besides, you've nowhere to go right now, do you?" Harriet flinched at that truth. She had no possessions, no money, nowhere, safe to return to. "Stay as long as you need," he offered gently. "You're not alone." The sincerity in his voice brought fresh tears to Harriet's eyes. For so long she'd felt trapped by her father's aspirations, by Jeremy's oppressive demands. Now in this kind stranger's home, she sensed something she hadn't felt in ages, genuine kindness. Levi returned with a neat bundle of clothes, a simple dress, and some undergarments that had once belonged to Colton's late mother. Harriet accepted them with shaking hands, grateful beyond words. When Colton stepped away to give her privacy, Harriet slipped into a small adjoining room and carefully changed out of her soaked garments. She relished the warmth of the fresh fabric against her skin. Once dressed, Harriet emerged and sat near the fire, accepting a steaming cup of tea from Hank. She sipped slowly the hot liquid, soothing her frayed nerves. The ranch hands hovered nearby, politely, curious but respectful of her space. Harriet looked up at Colton, her voice thin but resolute. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," she said, the weight of gratitude pressing on her heart. "You saved my life out there." Colton offered a kind smile. "I'd do the same for anyone in your situation," he replied. "But if you really want to show your thanks, take the time to recover. Think about what you want for your future. You're safe here." In Harriet's mind, images of the lake, Jeremy's hateful stare, and the suffocating grasp of her old life collided with the warmth of her new surroundings. For the first time, she felt she might shape her own destiny. Yet a small voice in her heart told her that no man as good and kind as Colton Granger existed without secrets of his own. The next days would reveal not only Harriet's path forward, but also the hidden depths of the man who had rescued her from the brink. For a few days, Harriet rested at High Plains Haven. She explored the ranch's wide porches and wood-paneled corridors, taking comfort in the daily rhythms of ranch life. Men rose before dawn to tend to the cattle, and the clamor of horses' hooves echoed through the dusty yard. Even the smell of fresh hay and horse sweat was oddly reassuring, reminding Harriet of how different this world was from the suffocating wagon train Colton checked on her frequently. Though busy with ranch matters, he managed to steal moments to bring her fresh bread from the cook stove or to ask how she was doing. Harriet found herself torn between relief at his kindness and a growing curiosity about the man who had intervened so decisively in her life. One evening, Harriet wandered outside to catch the last hues of sunset over the plains. Colton was there on the porch, leaning against a wooden post, his gaze lost in the orange sky. She stepped quietly beside him. For a moment, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, shadows stretching across the ranch yard. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. Colton nodded. "Always has been. Even after all these years, I still marvel at how the sky can swallow a man's troubles." She glanced at him sidelong. "Thank you for everything you've done. I still can't believe how quickly it all happened." Colton's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes reflecting a distant sorrow. "I'm just glad I was there in time," he replied. He exhaled slowly, as though haunted by some memory. "I've seen too many folks on this frontier fall prey to cruelty. Couldn't stand by and let it happen again. Again." Harriet caught the subtle weight in that single word. "Have you seen something like what happened to me before?" A storm of remembrance crossed Colton's face. He hesitated, as though deciding how much to reveal. Eventually he spoke. "My mother," he began, his voice low. "She was a kind woman, with a heart big enough for the whole frontier. But my father was troubled. Gambling debts, a quick temper, you name it. He never did right by her. She died before I could protect her from his ways," the confession hung in the twilight air. Harriet placed a gentle hand on Colton's arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, swallowing hard. "I can't change the past, but I swore I'd never let another soul be crushed under cruelty if I could stop it." He turned to Harriet, his eyes softening. "That's why I did what I did, and why I'll keep doing it, if Jeremy or anyone else tries to come after you." Harriet felt her heart clench with empathy for the man beside her. In that moment, she realized they shared a bond forged by the raw edges of life. Both had known what it was like to feel trapped, helpless at the mercy of someone else's power. The sun disappeared below the horizon, the sky shifting into a blanket of stars. Quiet filled the space between them, a hush that felt both comforting and charged. As the ranch settled into its nocturnal calm, Harriet stole a glance at Colton and realized that her gratitude was turning into something deeper, an admiration, a longing she'd never allowed herself to feel. Yet she also knew the memory of Jeremy's threat still lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. She couldn't remain hidden at High Plains Haven forever. When the time came to confront her past or shape her future, Harriet wondered if she would be brave enough to stand firm, or if her newfound freedom would slip away like the setting sun. The morning haze lingered as Harriet stepped outside to watch the ranch hands prepare for the day's work. A gentle breeze stirred the dust in the yard, and the rhythmic clink of tack and harnesses created a familiar soundtrack. She felt safer here than she ever had on the wagon train. Yet she was acutely aware that the outside world still loomed, and Jeremy was out there somewhere. She didn't have to wait long for that reminder. Mid-morning, while Harriet helped Levi gather laundry from the clotheslines, a young ranch hand rode up in a hurry. His horse was lathered from a hard gallop, and sweat beaded on the man's brow. "Mr. Granger," he called, leaping off the saddle. "Bad news from the North Ridge." Colton emerged from the barn, adjusting his gloves. "What is it, Tully?" Tully shot Harriet a wary glance before clearing his throat. "Or ran into some folks from that wagon train, Carter family." I think Harriet's pulse quickened at the mention. "They were asking if you had a woman named Harriet Mackenzie here. Told me something about her belonging to them." Harriet felt an involuntary shudder. Even after her dramatic escape, the Carters still claimed ownership. Anger and fear twisted in her gut. She noticed Colton's face harden. "What did you tell them?" Colton asked, voice steady but threaded with steel. Tully grimaced. "I played dumb, sir. Said I didn't know any Harriet Mackenzie, but they didn't look convinced. They said they'd come by the ranch to see for themselves. Might even bring a few more men to help them retrieve her." A hush settled over the ranch yard. Harriet's heart pounded. Colton removed his gloves and exhaled slowly. "Well, Tully, you did right. Thank you." He turned to Harriet, his expression apologetic. "Seems like your troubles aren't finished yet." Levi, standing nearby, spat in the dirt. "No man has the right to claim a woman like property." Colton nodded in agreement. "Agreed? But Jeremy Carter thinks differently." He looked at Harriet, his gaze both protective and questioning. "We need to decide what to do, Harriet. We can't let them drag you away." Harriet drew in a trembling breath. "I don't want to run anymore. I'm tired of running." Her voice shook, but her resolve was firm. "I want to stand my ground." Colton's eyes flickered with approval. "Then that's what we'll do. High Plains. Haven can withstand a few men with misguided intentions." Still, the tension in the air was undeniable. Harriet knew all too well the Carters' willingness to resort to violence. The ranch hands exchanged knowing looks, already anticipating a confrontation. Colton laid a reassuring hand on Harriet's shoulder. "We'll handle this," he said quietly. "Nobody's taking you from here." She looked at him, remembering the vow he'd made under the porch's glow. Harriet understood that the moment of truth was approaching. The short-lived tranquility she'd found here was about to be tested, yet her heart flickered with determination. This time, she wouldn't stand by and let others decide her fate. If Jeremy Carter and his men were coming, so be it. She'd face them supported by the man who had risked his life to save hers. Unbeknownst to either Harriet or Colton, destiny had another twist in store, one that would bring them closer than they ever thought possible, and force them to choose a path that neither had foreseen. By late afternoon, High Plains. Haven buzzed with preparation. Colton instructed his ranch hands to keep a lookout on all approaches. Every fence was checked, every rifle cleaned. While the ranch wasn't a fortress, Colton had built it with defense in mind, remembering the dangers of frontier life. A protective row of tall cottonwoods shielded one side, while open plains stretched out on the other, allowing a clear view of anyone approaching. Harriet helped where she could, fetching water, offering to load extra rounds of ammunition. She caught glimpses of Colton and the others working in hushed efficiency, and her heart swelled with gratitude. These men had no obligation to defend her from the Carters, yet they stood by her side nonetheless. As dusk arrived, Harriet found herself alone in the stable, stroking Marshall's mane. The horse nickered softly, sensing her unease. She sighed, pressing her forehead against the stallion's neck. "Thank you for carrying me away from that place," she whispered, feeling a pang of both fear and hope. Would she have the courage to face Jeremy again? Soft footsteps approached, and she turned to see Colton standing at the stable door. "Mind if I come in?" he asked gently. She nodded, and he stepped closer. In the dim light of the lanterns, Harriet could see lines of worry etched on his face. "I wanted to check on you," he said, removing his hat. "You've had a rough few days." She offered a weak smile. "I'm all right. Nervous, I suppose." But determined, Colton returned her smile admiration in his eyes. "I respect that." He ran a hand along Marshall's flank. "This horse has saved my hide more than once. Glad he was there for you too." They stood quietly for a moment, the soft sounds of shifting hay and the gentle snorts of the horses filling the stable. Harriet felt a warmth bloom in her chest, an unexpected sense of belonging. She realized how dangerous it was, letting her heart open to a man she barely knew. Yet everything about Colton felt sincere and safe. "I've been thinking," Colton said, carefully, breaking the silence, "about what might happen if Jeremy shows up tonight or tomorrow. He'll be spoiling for a fight." Harriet's stomach twisted, but she held her chin high. "I won't let him bully me again. I promise you that." Colton's expression grew serious. "Harriet, I want to protect you, but I'm also aware that confrontation could lead to bloodshed. The Carters might not walk away quietly." Harriet swallowed hard. She knew the risk was real. "Then I'll face that risk," she said softly, "because living in fear of them forever isn't living at all." Colton reached out, and for the first time his hand found hers. The gentle pressure sent a flutter through Harriet's body. "You have more courage than you know," he said quietly. "And, Harriet, no matter what happens, I want you to know, you have a place here, not just as someone I rescued, but—" He trailed off his gaze, lingering on her face. She felt her cheeks warm, a sudden rush of emotion, making her lightheaded. Did he mean what she thought he meant? Before she could respond, a shout echoed from outside, riders approaching. The call reverberated through the still evening air. Harriet's heart lurched. She and Colton exchanged a charged glance. In that instant, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever words remained unspoken would have to wait until after they faced the storm at the gate. The echo of hooves and shouting voices filled the twilight as Harriet and Colton rushed outside along the ranch's perimeter. Ranch hands stood armed and alert, forming a loose defensive line. In the distance, Harriet made out shapes in the fading light, at least half a dozen riders approaching. Leading them was unmistakably Jeremy Carter. The tension was palpable. Harriet's hands trembled, but she clenched her jaw, steeling her resolve. Colton signaled his men to hold their ground, then advanced several steps ahead, Harriet by his side. As the riders drew closer, Jeremy reined in his horse, dust swirling around them. He looked furious, eyes dark with intent. Several of his cousins flanked him, rifles resting across their saddles. Harriet recognized Bill and Carl among them, faces grim. The rest were likely friends or hired guns. "This is private property," Colton called his voice, cutting through the dusk. "State your business or move along." Jeremy glared, barely able to contain his anger. "I've come for Harriet," he growled. "She's my fiancée, promised by her father, and you've no right to keep her here." Colton's jaw flexed. He rested a hand on the grip of his revolver, though he didn't draw. "Harriet is free to choose where she wants to be," he said, his voice cold, "and she chooses to stay here." Jeremy turned his gaze on Harriet. "Harriet, get over here!" he barked. "We can settle this without bloodshed, if you just do what you're supposed to do." A flare of white-hot anger coursed through Harriet. She stepped forward, refusing to cower. "I'm not yours," she said sharply. "I never was. I tried to tell you that months ago, and you wouldn't listen. I've had enough." Bill Carter spat onto the ground. "She's a Carter's bride, whether she likes it or not. You want to do this the hard way." His rifle twitched in his grip. Colton raised a warning hand to his men, signaling them not to fire unless provoked. "We won't allow you to kidnap Harriet," he said sternly. "Leave now, and we can all avoid something we'll regret." With a frustrated snarl, Jeremy drew his revolver faster than Harriet had anticipated, but Colton was quick. In a single fluid motion, he yanked Harriet behind him and drew his own gun, leveling it at Jeremy. The ranch hands tensed, a dozen barrels suddenly aimed at the intruders. A heartbeat passed. The thick tension of imminent violence filled the air. "Don't do it," Colton warned. We have you outnumbered, outgunned, and you're on our land. Lower your weapon. Jeremy." Jeremy's eyes flickered with malice. The memory of his humiliation at the lake spurred him on. He was about to pull the trigger. Harriet saw his finger tighten. Instinctively, she gasped. But then a strange sound cut through the hush, a rider thundering up from behind Jeremy's group, calling out, "Hold your fire! Hold it!" All heads turned. Harriet's father, George Mackenzie, rode into the fray, pale and breathless. He reined in his horse between the two sides, nearly colliding with Jeremy. "Enough!" George pleaded, his voice cracking. "Don't you see we're standing on the edge of catastrophe?" Jeremy, furious at the interruption, snapped. "Out of my way, old man. This is between me and them." George shook his head violently, eyes darting from Harriet to Jeremy. "Listen to me," he shouted. "Harriet isn't a piece of property. I realize now I made a terrible mistake forcing this betrothal. If you harm her or anyone here, you'll regret it." Harriet's eyes welled with tears, her heart pounding. She'd never heard such resolve from her father. Was it too little, too late? The next seconds would decide. George, Mackenzie's words hung in the night air. Jeremy trembled with rage, his revolver still trained. The ranch hands stood unwavering, ready to defend Harriet at a moment's notice. Finally, Jeremy let out a snarl and shoved George aside with his free hand. "You're a pathetic father," he hissed. "No wonder your daughters run amok." But Harriet's father didn't back down. This time, instead, he rode up beside Colton and Harriet, his posture stiff with determination. "I was wrong to force Harriet into marriage with you." George managed voice, trembling yet resolute. "It's her life, not mine. I won't let you harm her." Harriet stared astonished at her father's transformation. All her life, she'd known him as a man who cowered before those stronger than him, choosing the safest path even at her expense. Now he finally seemed to recognize the cost of his own cowardice. Harriet stepped forward, gently placing a hand on his arm. He met her gaze, eyes brimming with regret and unspoken apologies. "Jeremy Colton," said his voice, cutting through the charged moment, "we're giving you one last chance to turn around and leave without bloodshed." Bill Carter and the others glanced at each other, tension coiling in the space between them. Did they really want to die? For Jeremy's bruised pride. The muzzle of Colton's revolver remained fixed on Jeremy's chest. That was when Harriet, her heart pounding like a drum, spoke. "Jeremy, you tried to force me into a marriage I never wanted. You tried to drown me. You'd better leave now and never come near me again." For an instant, Jeremy looked close to lunging at her, but the ring of gun barrels pointed his way, forced him to hesitate. With a frustrated curse, he holstered his revolver. "Fine," he spat, "but this ain't over." The Carter men, their bravado sapped, began to wheel their horses around. Harriet's chest heaved with relief, her body trembling. She clung to Colton's arm for stability as Jeremy and his companions retreated. Bill turned in the saddle to aim one last glare at Harriet, then urged his horse into a gallop in moments. The pounding of hooves faded into the night. A stunned silence followed. Then the ranch hands exhaled, lowering their weapons. Harriet realized she was shaking. Colton, noticing, put a comforting arm around her. Her father dismounted, stiffly, glancing at Harriet like he feared she might reject him completely. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his eyes brimming with shame. "For everything I should have protected you," though her trust in him was shattered. Harriet recognized the sincerity in his voice. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly she gave a small nod. "I appreciate that you came, Pa." She used the old familiar word, surprising herself. George's face crumpled, as though a weight had lifted from his soul. Colton cleared his throat, addressing the gathered ranch hands. It's late, folks. Let's all get some rest. We'll keep a watch tonight, just in case." The men dispersed, some shaking their heads in relief at the confrontation that nearly turned bloody. That night, Harriet found she could scarcely sleep. She thought about how swiftly her life had changed from near drowning to shelter in Colton Granger's home, and now a narrow escape from a deadly confrontation. Her father's unexpected support also weighed on her mind. Did it redeem him, or had he come too late? In the quiet hours before dawn, Harriet made a decision. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch where Colton paced vigilant for any sign of trouble. She spoke softly into the hush of night. "Colton, if we truly want to put an end to Jeremy's claims, there's only one way to do it." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "I need to be married to someone else." Today, Colton's eyes widened. For a moment, he stood in stunned silence. Then understanding flickered across his features. "Harriet," he began gently, "I don't want you to feel forced." She shook her head. "I'm not forced. I'm choosing, and I choose you. You saved my life. You gave me a place to belong. I want to stand beside you, if you'll have me." Emotion churned into Colton's expression. Surprise, relief, tenderness. "Harriet," he breathed, stepping close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body in the chilly night air. "Are you sure?" She smiled through gathering tears. "Yes, I'm sure." He brushed his hand across her cheek, and in the hush of the pre-dawn darkness, they sealed the vow that would change their lives forever. By morning, a wedding would be prepared, swift, unorthodox, but as strong as the beating hearts that desired it. True to Harriet's bold pronouncement, the ranch bustled at dawn with unexpected wedding preparations. Levi and Hank built a simple arch of wildflowers near the ranch house. Hank joked about how the only preachers nearby were all at least half cowboys themselves, but Colton sent a rider to Dodge City in the early morning light to fetch a circuit preacher who had once owed him a favor. Harriet's father, George, though still racked with guilt, helped where he could, collecting bouquets of sunflowers from the nearby fields, offering Harriet words of encouragement in hushed tones. He knew this was a day of reckoning, not just for Harriet's future, but for the mistakes he had made in the past. By midday, the preacher arrived, an affable man named Reverend Samuel Tilghman, who recognized Colton immediately and greeted him with a hearty clap on the back. "Never thought I'd see you settle down, Mr. Granger," he teased, eyebrows waggling. Colton responded with a sheepish grin. "The good Lord moves in mysterious ways, Reverend." The entire ranch gathered by the makeshift arch. A gentle breeze carried the scent of hay and wildflowers. Harriet emerged from the ranch house, wearing a simple white dress borrowed from a neighbor's daughter. Her hair was braided a few loose strands, framing her radiant smile. As she stepped forward, Colton could scarcely breathe. She was the most beautiful sight he'd ever beheld. Reverend Tillman cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Harriet's hand trembled in Colton's as she said her vows, a cascade of emotions surging through her. Yes, it was swift. Yes, it might raise eyebrows among polite society, but their connection was forged in the crucible of life or death choices. Harriet knew, with every beat of her heart, that Colton was the man she wanted by her side. When Reverend Tillman pronounced them husband and wife, a soft cheer rose among the gathered ranch hands. Harriet and Colton sealed their union with a kiss applause, echoing across the open land. The newlyweds couldn't help but beam at each other, relief and joy shining in their eyes. No matter what the future held, they had chosen each other on this day of all days. But fate had a way of balancing scales. That same afternoon, news trickled down from another traveler who arrived at the ranch. Jeremy Carter and his cousins, in their raging exodus, had run afoul of a band of outlaws near the Arkansas River. According to the rumor, the outlaws stole their horses and left them stranded in the wilderness. The Carter men were forced to trudge on foot to the nearest settlement, humiliated, exhausted, and diminished. It seemed that in the end, Jeremy's thirst for vengeance had led him to swift, rough justice. Harriet heard the tale from Levi, who relayed it with undisguised satisfaction. She felt neither pity nor triumph, only a quiet sense that karma had arrived, as Harriet and Colton stood side by side on the porch that evening, watching the sun sink over the High Plains haven. Harriet leaned into her husband's embrace, a soft contentment flowing through her. For the first time, the future looked bright and boundless. She might never forget the terror of nearly drowning in that lake, but it was that same horror that led her to the chance of real love, safety, and partnership. In the distance, the cattle stirred, the horses nickered, and the gentle hush of twilight settled over them. Harriet gazed up at Colton. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she murmured, "but I know I want to face it with you." Colton pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "We'll face it together," he promised. And in the quiet hush of the western plains, Harriet Mackenzie Granger, once a terrified bride-to-be forced into submission, found the fearless partner she never dreamed existed, and in return offered him the warmest peace of her heart. In a land where the unforgiving prairie tests the very core of every soul, Harriet and Colton Granger discovered that the strongest bonds are formed through courage and kindness, from a life-threatening encounter by the lakeshore to a wedding that defied every rule of polite society. Their union stands as a testament to hope, resilience, and the undeniable power of standing up to cruelty. If this story moved your heart or sparked your imagination, if you believe in the possibility of second chances and brave choices, then help us share this tale far and wide. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you dramatic stories of love, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit. Your support lets these extraordinary narratives ride into the sunset of our shared imagination. Thank you for listening, and remember, every ending is just the start of a new adventure.